Okay, I will just jump into it. So the only reason this particular presentation popped into my mind is because of that really hilarious and fun chat we had going on this morning about gimmicks, and it just anytime you're with wrestling fans and you start talking about gimmicks, then it just becomes like hilarious and fun. So I went back. I've given a whole bunch of presentations at different kinds of professional conferences on my particular area of interest, which is Christian professional wrestling in the South. It's a very particular thing. But I've given a couple of presentations that were not really on that. And this is the one that I'm going to sort of review now. It's not fresh in my mind, but it's one that I gave at the Pop Culture Association National Meeting in 2015. And the title of it is Scary, Foreign, Crazy, Stupid, Silly, Loathsome Killjoys, a half century of religious gimmicks in mainstream professional wrestling. Um, so the real audience for this is Brad Kelly, who I don't know if he's still with us. There are two other religious studies scholars that I'm aware of who are also massive pro wrestling fans and do scholarship on pro wrestling. And Brad was with us earlier today. The other one is Michael Muhammad Knight. Um, yeah, I gave this presentation, and it was the first time when I really got to bring together my religious studies background with my love for goofy gimmicks. I talked about this in our executive roundtable earlier. I love the goofy gimmick. I always have. Uh, we've already seen slides of the missing link and George the Animal Steel. Uh, but there are tons of them, especially late WCW era. I couldn't find my PowerPoint. I looked everywhere for my PowerPoint. I couldn't find it. I would not be giving this presentation. I would not have suggested that I do this, and were it not for the audience, because I will say the word missing link and everybody is going to know exactly what I'm talking about. Whereas in most other contexts, that would not be the case. Um, so yeah, I love goofy gimmicks, and one day it occurred to me that I have never read a full analysis of what are all the religion gimmicks that we've seen in what I'm calling mainstream professional wrestling. The way I'm defining that, I'm defining it by like sort of late 70s era wrestling, when the territory era was crumbling and you had several promoters who were sort of vying to take control of the whole wrestling landscape. And of course, Vince McMahon won that battle. So late 1970s to the present is how I'm defining mainstream wrestling. We've heard a lot of presentations so far have talked about Roland Barthes, of course, the seminal study on pro wrestling, and he spends time unpacking Moliere, that flabby bastard, as he calls him. And one of Bart's arguments is that pro wrestlers, they embody sort of the kind of cultural mythology. The point I made earlier in the day is that we're a long way from 1950s era French professional wrestling, especially when Vince McMahon takes the reins of the WWF in the early 80s, and he produces all these cartoon character over the top gimmicks. And so whatever Bart wrote about the 1950s French professional wrestling applies 1,000 times over to the era that we're in now. And of course, gimmicks now are different than they were in the 1980s and 90s for sure. So I want to do what I did in this presentation is I tried to unpack what I tried to discern and then unpack a full taxonomy of religious themed gimmicks in mainstream professional wrestling. And what I came up with were basically three categories. There's the Muslim themed wrestler, which I'll talk about. There is the Christian themed wrestler, which has a whole bunch of subcategories that are pretty interesting. And then there's sort of the catch-all miscellaneous category that that is a little bit fuzzy, and I'll get into that too. So we'll start with the Muslim-themed wrestling characters. This is the oldest religion gimmick that exists in professional wrestling. In fact, it might be the oldest gimmick period that's ever existed in professional wrestling. It goes all the way back to the turn of the 20th century, when there's a series of Terrible Turk characters that emerged. The Terrible Turks, there's a series of them. But we get a first real, fully formed Muslim team character with the original Sheik. It was mentioned already in the chat. In the sort of later territory, or 1960s and 70s. Now, this, if you've ever seen the Sheik, you can Google him. He had this routine when he came to the ring. He'd roll out a prayer mat. He would do this like parody of the Muslim Salat, Muslim prayer. Um, and he spawned a series of copycat Sheiks, including my all-time favorite right here, the Iron Sheik, who, when he, in his earlier years of wrestling, was more Muslim, explicitly Muslim themed than he became in his later days. There are also other kinds of Sheiks. Sheikh Adnan al-Kaisi, General Adnan, Colonel Mustafa. Sabu is a sort of a riff on this character, the Sultan. Um, and then Sheikh Ayatollah Blackwell and Sheikh Ken Patera, which only a few of you will remember. These were Middle Eastern sympathizers back in, I think, the late 70s. And even Sergeant Slaughter became a Sheikh turncoat at one point. All of these characters, no matter who they are, no matter what era, they all represented the Middle Eastern terror, that dark-skinned, brutal, quick-tempered, irrational America hater. All these characters are pretty much straight out of Edward Said's Orientalism, if you've read that. Now, there were a couple. Actually, there's two tag teams that I think are worth singling out for special consideration in the post 9/11 world. One, I think in the chat, this already came up, Muhammad Hassan and his translator, Khosrow Davari. These were anti-American characters in this post 9/11 world, and most famously, on the same day as the 2005 London subway bombing, London subway terrorist attacks on SmackDown, Hassan and Davari, they had this terrorist angle where Davari was wrestling, and if you've seen it, Hassan comes to the ring with a bunch of paramilitary crew, and they attack his opponent, and then they bear Davari's body aloft, sort of like in a Muslim funeral. Almost immediately, there was tremendous backlash. Like, this was, even for the world of wrestling, like they had crossed the line. And both wrestlers were pretty much instantly removed from the WWE roster, although Davari, he resurfaced pretty soon after that in TNA as Sheikh Abdul Bashir. Now, the second one I think is really interesting. One of my all-time favorite wrestling tag teams was the duo of Awesome Kong and Raisha Saeed from the 2000s era TNA. If I could find my presentation, I would have shown you a YouTube of what is my favorite entrance to one of their matches. And if all of us know who Awesome Kong is, Raisha Saeed wasn't around for that long. In that character, she was cheerleader Melissa was another one of her gimmicks. But in this entrance, Awesome Kong comes to the ring. She's the camera's like right on her, and so she fills up the whole frame, and you get this overwhelming sense of the blackness of her. Her armor is black, her skin is black. She's powerful, she's fierce, she's projected to be menacing and wild. And then you see Raisha Saeed, who is the only one who can control her. But you don't really even see Saeed because she's wearing what Taz, the commentator, calls a burqa, which is sort of the symbol of Islamist oppression and otherness. Now, this is 2008 when this particular match was. This is in the context of the Bush administration's axis of evil. We're still in the specter of 9/11, and Raisha Saeed, she gets to the ring and she pauses and she engages in prayer, which is like this Muslim prayer. And then she proceeds to, it looks like she's going to unveil, and Taz gets all excited and he's like, oh, she's gonna take it off. Sort of like the masculine gaze that's like all excited about what's underneath this burqa, and she takes it off, and what's underneath is another burqa. It's pretty hilarious. So she's like doubly marked by her Muslim identity. And all you can see is the slits of her eye makeup, which is like very decorative. So this duo, I think, is worth commenting on because they really hit a tremendously sensitive cultural nerve in 2008. They represented sort of this gendered, racial, ethnic, and religious other of the post 9/11 world. So those are the Muslim characters. They're all pretty much the same with different degrees of nuance, and it depends on which era they're in. So it depends on who America's enemy is, whether it's the scary Turks, whether it's Iran, then Iraq, and of course the Iron Sheik became an Iraqi general, which is hilarious. Second category of characters, there's much more variety here, is the Christian-themed gimmick. Uh, it's not too surprising that you get more variation with the Christian-themed characters in the U.S., given that this is a predominantly and historically Christian nation. But the way they've been depicted over the decades is, I think, pretty interesting. The subcategories that I've come up with the Christian-themed gimmicks. First one is the Christian buffoons, as I call them. The representatives here are the Flying Nuns, aka the Sisters of Love. Some of you may remember that. Friar Ferguson would be another. These are totally forgettable characters. They did not last long. They all play on the stereotypes of certain parts of Catholic piety, and they're presented as an absolute joke. Another one, which many of you will remember for sure, is Brother Love. He was around much longer. He hosted his own interview segments. He was also a buffoon, but he was a parody of the 1980s televangelists, especially like Jim Baker. A second category I'm calling the hypocrites. And the hypocrites, this is sort of a blaxploitation kind of hypocrite. Characteristic here would be the Reverend Devon, the Pope D'Angelo De Niro, and then actually before that, before both of them, the Doctor of Style Slick, who some of you may remember was reborn as the Reverend Slick at one point. Reborn, good little pun there. So these wrestlers are all African-American wrestlers who are playing on the sort of Creflo Dollar-esque parodies of the black megachurch preacher, big on the bling, slick of tongue, and popular with the ladies. A third category, so we have the buffoons, the blaxploitation hypocrites. Then we have the moralizers. Moralizers are probably my favorite category. Moralizers are the tiresome wet blankets. And they oftentimes are more developed than the other kinds of Christian characters. There's two in particular that I think are really interesting. One is Jake the Snake Roberts, and the other one is Dustin Reynolds / Goldust, who both had these brief runs as Christian moralizers. Jake Roberts, Carolyn, can you remind me how much time I have before I get into too much detail?
About 8 minutes.
Okay. So Jake Roberts, we all know him as Jake the Snake. Many of us also know that he had drug and alcohol problems, and that eventually derailed his career, and he disappeared from the scene for a number of years. But then he made his comeback as a convert to evangelical Christianity with a new snake. Right, he had Damien before. His new snake was an albino python named Revelations. This was actually a work shoot because Jake Roberts, the real Jake Roberts, did actually convert to evangelical Christianity in those intervening years. And then he depicted a character who had converted to evangelical Christianity. His interviews in that time, he would talk about his prior life of drugs and alcohol, and then he would talk about his new life of Bible reading and clean living. And then this evangelical face turn, a lot of you will remember, came at a really important moment for WWE history. It was the dawn of the Attitude Era. And he began this feud with Stone Cold Steve Austin, which culminated with the 1996 King of the Ring tournament, which is, of course, where Austin did his famous Austin 316 promo. Jake Roberts' his evangelical gimmick, it served mainly as a foil to the ranch and crass vulgarity that was soon to emerge in the Attitude Era. The born-again wrestler's message of moral rectitude was an unwanted wet blanket on the sophomore sexually explicit world of mainstream wrestling. And Roberts was soon dropped from the roster after actually more drug relapses. Another character, interesting one, another moralizer was the Goldust Dustin Reynolds one. So deep into his character's development, he converted to evangelical Christianity, and he emerged. So like Goldust, the sexual deviant, was born again as Dustin Reynolds, who was this prayerful moralizer caught up in the end times frenzy. And it was pretty hilarious because this was during the Attitude Era. He was playing on sort of a lampoon of the religious right at that point, and he had these commercials where Reynolds was the spokesman for the fictional Evangelists Against Television, Movies, and Entertainment. Acronym was EAT Me. And Reynolds would criticize wrestling's increasingly X-rated storylines and would encourage the audience to engage in healthy activities like Bible reading. and of course, it was a great heel character. Fans hated him. He sort of turned in one heel character, one loathsome character, the sexual deviant, for an equally repulsive one, which was the meddlesome evangelical who criticized everything that made the Attitude Era so much fun. Mordecai is another one. I won't talk about him. Some of you will remember him. He had tremendous build-up, and then he finally, when he wrestled, like, he fell flat. He was sort of an embodiment of the vengeful Jesus of Revelation 19. He was straight out of the Left Behind series, which was popular at the time. Shawn Michaels would be another one who fit into this category. He doesn't fit quite as easily. He wasn't quite as much of a moralizer, but the real Shawn Michaels did convert to evangelical Christianity. And then when he came back, he would refuse to do some of the things he did when he was with Generation X. Like, he wouldn't make the crotch symbol anymore because that was crossing a moralistic line. So his was a little bit more complicated. He wasn't quite the same moralizer. Fans, though, were kind of like, they didn't really take to this new Shawn Michaels. Last thing I'll say real quick, there's another category of, this is sort of the miscellaneous category, where it's hard to know what to do, how religious were these characters. One example would be, in this miscellaneous category, there were some Jewish characters that we've had. The two most notable ones that I can think of are Barry Horowitz, one of my favorite jobbers from the 80s and 90s era. The only way you knew he was Jewish, or I mean, you assume he's Jewish, is because he came to the ring with the song Hava Nagila. That was his theme song. Scotty Goldman, Colt Cabana, when his brief run in the WWE, he was a Jewish character. He played sort of an immature, coddled homeboy with ADD. There were some sort of Hindu-ish themed wrestlers. The Great Khali would be one. The only way you'd assume that he's Hindu is because the name Kali, which is a reference to the Hindu deity. You had other Indian wrestlers that aren't explicitly marked as being Hindu, but they are closely connected to Indian culture. Ranjan Singh, Jinder Mahal, and others. Another interesting category is sort of the Satanist category. An earlier presentation about the monstrous, I think a lot of them fit into this Satanism sort of thing. If you remember the 1980s, it was marked by the threat of like satanic ritual abuse. And that is the moment when we saw a whole bunch of vaguely Satanist demonic characters. The Dungeon of Doom, Vampiro, the Great Muta, Kiss Demon, Abyss, even Undertaker and Kane in the 90s. They both broke in the 90s, which was right on the heels of the Satanic Panic. You have a bunch of indigenous characters, African characters, Native Americans, Afro-Caribbean shamans. It's hard to know what to do with these. They only sort of have loose connections with religion. But this all raises, this is what I'll end with, an interesting point for a scholar of religion, is because this fuzzy category, like where do you separate culture from religion? Well, this is something that religious studies scholars talk about, have known for a long time, is that the idea of religion as a separate category that's distinct from other parts of culture is a distinctly Western idea. And it does not apply, it does not translate into other non-Western cultures. And that actually shows up in the wrestling ring, where we get wrestling characters who are supposed to be embodiments of different kinds of cultures and ethnicities, and it's hard to know what to do with them as religious. Hard to know what to do with them religiously. How do they separate the religion from the culture? So that's my taxonomy of wrestling gimmicks through the history of mainstream professional wrestling. This is our cultural mythology, as Bart sort of alluded to, updated. So in the world of wrestling, religious folk are either, number one, terrifying, brutal America haters, those are the Muslims, or they are buffoons, smooth-talking hypocrites, tiresome moralizers, and killjoys, those are the Christian characters, or they are simpletons, mollycoddles, or culturally strange, and those are a lot of the categories in this, of characters in this other category. That's it.
All right. Thank you, Dan. I know we've been talking about a lot of different characters here on in the chat. So
yeah, I could see. I have it open and I wasn't reading it, but I saw lots of text popping up. Anytime you talk about gimmicks, everyone gets all excited.
And one thing that we brought up too was the Sami Zayn and how he is Muslim, and yet that's never a part of his character except for briefly on NXT or with his ring gear.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Um, I don't know what to comment about that, but I wonder how much he gets to control his character compared to, especially when the characters that Vince wrote all are cartoon. Obviously, it's Vince, right?
And at one point, there was also, I believe, a woman from Saudi Arabia who was joining NXT. And there are other Saudi Arabian joining NXT, but I don't think we've been hearing much from them. DeWitt says she left.
Huh. Yeah. I'm so as you can probably tell, like um my the my area of knowledge when it comes to mainstream wrestling is all like in the 80s and 90s, and then like the more contemporary stuff I kind of lose interest. Although AEW makes it interesting again. For me, the more interesting stuff is all in the indies, especially the high level indies. Um, so yeah, I'd be like fascinated to know like what's going on in the world of WWE over the last like 5 years that I haven't been paying close enough attention to. I didn't know about this character in NXT.
Okay, cool. All right, well, that brings us to